This lesson is implementing promises for asynchronous JavaScript. The objectives for this lesson are to understand how to utilize promises, employ the then, catch, and finally methods, practice chaining promises together, and reimagine the setTimeout function with promises. A promise in JavaScript is an object pointing to an asynchronous function that either succeeds or fails. You pass in two callback functions, one for success and one for failure. A promise is in one of three states: pending, which means it hasn't completed yet; fulfilled, where it's been successful or resolved; or rejected, which is a failure. We create a promise by using the promise constructor. So create the promise and pass in a callback function. And then what we do is we run whatever code we want to run within the promise, and then eventually you call your callback function, and that then invokes the then portion on your function. So I've got this function called fetch. I'm going to pass Paul to fetch. It goes in, it creates the promise, and then when the resolve callback function is invoked, the .then takes over, and the argument that I'm passing to resolve gets put into the parameter result, and then I can do whatever I want to do with that. So let's take a look at using a promise constructor in JavaScript. In this HTML file, let's take a look at our script. So down here I'm going to call fetch, passing in Paul. I have a .then. The then method is called when the promise is resolved, and any values that you pass are going to be accepted into the result. I'm just using an arrow function here, so that's the parameter coming into this function. And all I'm going to do is do a console.log on result. I've got another console.log here after the fetch Paul call. Then let's take a look down here on line 49. There's my function fetch, passing in the value, which in this case is Paul. I'm going to put that out onto the console window as well, and then I'm going to return a new promise, passing in our callback resolve, and then when that resolve is invoked and pass this success value equals that value, that's what's going to be then invoking the .then back on line 34. Let's go ahead and try this out. Bring up our window here, and you can see we're in the fetch Paul function after the fetch Paul call, and then success value equals Paul. So what we've done is we've created this function pointer that is ready to be executed at some time. So a promise, think of it kind of like a setTimeout, in that whatever code you put within that promise is the code that is going to be run asynchronously. Again, if we look back, we can see in the fetch function, that's the first thing that came out, right? Then any code within the promise is going to be invoked. So that's the resolve. And then you see the after the fetch Paul call, right? Let's go back to the browser and let's take a look. So after the fetch Paul call happened, because that promise was put into the event queue, just like the setTimeout was, and then it ran, and that's when we then finally got the success value equals Paul. Let's now take a look at using two promise callbacks. So we create a new promise again using the constructor. We pass in two callbacks, resolve and reject. So then you would, again, write some code to run asynchronously. Whenever that code finishes, we then check the value, and if that is true, we're going to resolve. If not, we're going to reject. So this is how you can get a resolve and a reject going. Let's take a look at passing two callbacks to our promise constructor. In this HTML, we've already seen the then portion. So you see on line 29, we've got our then. Well, there's actually two parameters you can pass to the then if you want. The first one is the result that comes back if everything is correct. The second parameter is the error callback. So that's the reject portion. Now in this one, I'm going to call fetch, passing in a false. So when we look down here in the function fetch, we're passing in this value. We're going to return a new promise with the resolve and the reject. Now I'm going to check if value, then we'll resolve, but it's not, it's false. So we're going to go into the else here where we're going to call reject. We're going to create a new error object that then gets passed back. And you can see now on line 36, that's where I'm going to display that error message on the console.error. Let's go ahead and run this one, and we'll take a look. So you can see we call the fetch after the fetch, and now we're in that error callback. And you can see the error message that I had. An error occurred in the promise. So this is one way that you can use a resolve and reject. Now that is not the most ideal way. What we really want to do is, instead of using two callbacks on the then method, we want to chain a catch method to the then method. It does the exact same thing, but a little bit simpler to understand. The logic flows better. We're not having to worry about two parameters to the then. So now when we call fetch data and either true or false, it's either going to go into the then or it's going to go into the catch if something goes wrong. So let's take a look at using the catch method for error handling in JavaScript. So yet another HTML file, and now you can see pretty much what I had there on the slide. Line 27, fetch. I'm going to pass in a false because we've already seen the then portion. We've seen the success part. But now you'll notice that the then only gets the first parameter, the first callback function, and that's for the resolve. Okay, the other one is the catch block. So where the catch method catches that error, and then we do whatever we're going to do with that error. Now, down here in the function fetch, I've changed it just a little bit. I wanted to show you another way to do things. Could have still done it with passing in that resolve and reject. But look what I've done. I've said if the value, then return promise.resolve. So we're just resolving this right away, or we're rejecting it right away. This is not a very common design pattern. You typically use the other one where you do a new promise, but I wanted to show you that it does have some static methods, resolve and reject, on the promise object. Either way you do it, right? You're going to have the resolve or the reject, which is then going to go to the then or the catch. Let's go ahead and run this, and we'll see we basically get the same exact result that we got from our last example. So we're still getting the error in this case. You notice this design pattern is very similar to the try catch that we have in JavaScript. So just like the try catch, we also have a finally method, which is called after either success or failure of the promise. So we use this for code that must always run, maybe displaying a final message or closing any resources such as web API connections, maybe terminating web work or something like that. So let's take a look at the promise finally method. So in this HTML file, now you see the fetch, and then we have the then, we have the catch, and now we have the finally. So whichever way we go through, true or false, right? So the then or the catch, the finally is always going to run. So on line 28, I'm calling fetch with true. On line 44, I'm calling the fetch with false. So down here in the fetch, it's the same one we saw in the last sample there. And when we run this, we're going to get the two values. Success value equals true, and in the catch method. And then after both of those, we're going to get in the finally method for success and in the finally method for the error. You are allowed to chain promises together. So this is where you want to run a series of asynchronous tasks, and each asynchronous task must return another promise. And then we just chain a series of then methods together. The values returned from one promise may be passed to the next. Let's take a look at chaining promises together. In this HTML page, let's take a look down here, lines 43 through 50, where I've created my function fetch that we're going to pass a value in. I'm now going back to the better design pattern, return a new promise. I'm just going to use a resolve in this particular one. I don't need a reject. So I'm just going to simply resolve this when successful, which then means that's going to then up here call the then method. So the first time in, I call fetch action, and then I get that result. And then look on line 34. Return fetch adventure. So that returns another promise. So again, I have to basically resolve that. So I use another .then method chained to the first one. I get the result back. I then return fetch comedy. So again, another promise is created. So I've got to resolve it. So I need another .then. So if we run this, we can see all three of them now have been resolved, and they all spit out whatever they're supposed to onto the console window. Take a look at another example where we're chaining promises with different timeouts. So down here in this HTML file, I'm going to call that fetch again, but I'm passing in action, 3 here on line 28. So in the function, value, seconds is what I'm receiving, and I'm using that seconds in the setTimeout, which is inside of that promise. So after a certain number of milliseconds, I'm going to resolve. And that resolve then says, well, call the then on the fetch up here on line 29. And then look at the next one, return fetch adventure, 2. That gets resolved. It goes into the next then, and we then return fetch comedy, 1. So you can see I've got different timeout values, right? So 3 seconds, 2 seconds, and then 1 second. Now let's think about what's going to happen here, right? If I run this and we bring up the window here, we see called fetch action. That takes 3 seconds. Then adventure takes 2 seconds, and then comedy finally resolves, but it does it after just 1 second. So the promises get added in order, okay? But then it waits for that because it's wrapped in that setTimeout, right? So the promise is kind of this additional wrapper around it that says, wow, I'm really taking advantage of asynchronous programming now. So if you have a lot of these chained promises together, how do you catch the errors for them? And what happens if one fails? Does it keep going on to the other then? Well, let's take a look. In this HTML file, I'm fetching action. I have a .then that gets that value. Then I return fetch adventures. That's another promise. We then concatenate that on or chain that together under the next then. And then we return fetch comedy, and that gives us that final then. But I have a catch block across all of these. So what's going to happen here? Well, if we take a look down here into our fetch function, you can see on line 48, I'm returning a new promise with both a resolve and a reject. But look at this. On line 51, I'm checking to see if the value equals adventure, then reject with this new error object with the message an error occurred in promise. Otherwise, resolving. So if we look up here, the first one is action, so that's going to resolve. The second one, though, is adventure. That's the one that's going to fail. So we know it's going to go to the catch block. What happens, though, to the comedy one? Is that one ever going to even be resolved? Let's go ahead and run this, bring up our console window, and we can see that we get the value equals action, but when we hit value equals adventure, it's jumping into that catch block. We spit out the error, and that's it. Nothing else goes on. Nothing else is chained together. So when you have a catch block across all of these chained ones, boom, one thing happens, it's done, and there's no more chaining. So we've seen a lot of ways to use this promise to perform asynchronous programming, but remember the setTimeout. Okay, that still uses a callback. Well, let's rewrite setTimeout as a promise. In this HTML page, right down here on line 26, I created a function called wait, passing in a number of milliseconds. I then return a new promise, resolve, and I do a setTimeout on that resolve, milliseconds. So what happens? Well, because we're saying promise, if I do a wait 2000, that passes the 2000 into the milliseconds. And then when I do the then, that's the resolve. So the resolve is actually what? setTimeout. So it now does a setTimeout for however many milliseconds, and then it executes this console.log. This message appears after approximately 2 seconds. So if we go ahead and run this, and we bring up the window, we see after about 2 seconds, that message appears. So now this is nice. We're not having to create a callback anymore inside of that setTimeout. We've rewritten it as a promise so that we can make it a little bit more in line. An alternate way to do this would be just use it as a function expression here. So constant, wait alternate, pass in a number of milliseconds, arrow syntax, new promise, and then we do a wait alternate for 3 seconds, .then is then fired, and it does the console.log. In this lesson, we learned to use promises. We used the then method that runs upon successful completion of a promise. We use the catch method that runs when the promise is not successful. And the finally method runs every single time. We also learned to chain promises together, and we used a promise to make setTimeout easier to use. Coming up next, the async and await keywords in JavaScript.